we're talking about religions. They're peoples. They're different peoples. I mean, if we, how well people define races, I'm not sure, but clearly there are different languages that are being spoken. The other part of the identity sometimes of peoples is their religion. And what are the religions that, if we're thinking about this area that goes from east to central to western Asia, that we ought to be thinking about?
The first one that comes to mind would be Buddhism, which is so hugely important in China and in Central Asia. Comes up from India. Some of it goes via the sea routes, a lot of it goes overland. Some of the most dramatic evidence, as we've already seen, comes from the exchanges dealing with Buddhism. Christianity in the Tang Dynasty appears in China. What we call Nestorian, the Church of the East, which was considered by the Catholic Church in the West to be heretical.
So not the Pope?
Not the Pope, no.
Okay.
That's later, under the Mongols, when in fact you find that a Catholic bishopric is established in China, and the Pope is actually sending clergy
So this would be
China.
the 13th, 14th
Yeah, the 13th,
century.
14th centuries. And then we have Zoroastrianism, which was a major religion in the Iranian Middle East. It travels through Central Asia. Some of the carriers of it, whom we'll be talking about, show up in China, and they bring their religion. And Manichaeism, which is much less well known, but also traveled the Silk Roads.
So where does Manichaeism come from?
It came from the Middle East also, from the area of what we would now call northern Iraq, northeastern Iran.
And so these exist before Islam
Yes.
is going to spread.
Yes, Christianity comes into China roughly at the same time as the rise of Islam, but its arrival there isn't connected with the rise of Islam, as far as we know.
Okay. We were talking about Buddhism, and in thinking about how to talk about that, and talk about the Silk Roads, and talk about Central Asia, and talk about geography and peoples and cultures, I thought it would be really interesting if we could ask you to bring us through the journey of one of the great Buddhist pilgrims of the Tang Dynasty, the monk known as Xuanzang. He's forbidden to leave Chang'an, but he sneaks out, goes off on his way to what we now call India in search of the Dharma. He's abroad for almost 20 years, comes back. What I would like to ask you to do is walk us through his journey. But perhaps we could begin by giving an overall view of the world that we're talking about, of Eastern Asia, Central Asia, and Western Asia, with this timeline.
We are talking about roughly this period right down here, the early to mid-600s. We have in the West the Byzantine Empire, the very beginnings of what we call the Islamic dynasties.
The end of the Sasanians.
And then in Central Asia, we have this group that most people have never heard of called the Sogdians. As you can see on this particular diagram, they are central to everything.
We will come back then.
And then down here we have the Tang Dynasty.
Okay, which gives us East Asia.
Yes.
So we've moved now from all the way from the West, Byzantium, to the East.
Well, if you're going to go west into what the Chinese like to call the Western regions, normally from Chang'an you go up through the Heishi Corridor, which is an obvious route that kind of goes northwest through what is now Gansu, and it brings you out at the edge of the Tarim Basin where the deserts are. It's very dry country, but there is water flowing through it that comes down from the mountains, so you can travel the whole length and find water along the route. When you get to the desert, of course, you have to be much more careful. Oases are spread far apart, and in fact, there's a very dramatic passage in Xuanzang where he says, I set out with my 1 or 2 companions and my poor horse, and a sandstorm came up, and I wasn't sure I would survive. And then, of course, he prayed to the Bodhisattva or the Buddha, and he was saved. And so he arrives at the oasis, and of course, when he gets to these oases on the northern fringe of the deserts, he finds that there are flourishing settlements. There are local rulers who, in that region, tended to be patrons of Buddhism. There are major Buddhist monasteries because Buddhism was already there and had been established for a number of centuries.
And so he's going north, just south of the Tian Shan Mountains,
Yes.
along the northern rim of the Taklamakan Desert. How does he get out of there?